IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. That's Trevor. I'm Bryan, and I am ready to rock and roll. I know that dude is. Trevor, a lot to talk about this week, man. We're going to have some fun. We're going to get a chance this weekend to sit down and relax and watch some football. I know you guys are going to be in town, so we're going to get together for dinner. It's going to be fun. I'm going to get a chance to meet your wife. And it's going to be a fun week. But we're going to have a fun slate of shows coming up this week too, Trevor. I'm going to preview today's show here in a second. But here's our plan for this week, just so you guys understand and can expect what we're going to do on the big show at 1 o'clock here this week. Today, Trevor and I are going to talk about Notre Dame at the break, and we're going to talk about the final stretch run. We're going to go over each of the four opponents. We're going to talk about the emergence of the Notre Dame offense and what is fueling it. And is the offense truly better, or are they playing teams that aren't that good on defense? And we'll talk about that. And then the final segment of today's show, Trevor, is going to be talking about the Notre Dame defense and can it really continue in the final four games, what we have seen in the first 8, right? With all the injuries and some, looking at the teams that are on the schedule. Tomorrow, we're going to do Buy, Sell, Hold. The entire show is Buy, Sell, Hold. So if you're a premium board member, there is a thread already on there. Don't hold back and wonder, I don't know if mine's going to get read this week. It is all Buy, Sell, Hold, baby, this week. And then Thursday, Trevor and I are going to kind of break down the Notre Dame team and really dive into things we want to see for the remainder of the season from the offense. What improvements do we want to see from the offense? What improvements do we want to see from the defense? And then, of course, I'll be joined by Bill Bender to preview the big weekend games. And then Friday, Trevor and I are going to have a mailbag. So that is the plan. And then it's going to be a really, really fun week. And then Thursday, when Bill Bender and I get together, of course, we're going to preview the big games of the weekend, Trevor. And when I start thinking about some of those big games and thoughts, and I know that every time I talk to you and Vince and my buddy Jason, there's always talk about, hey, where's your action going to be this weekend? And so with that in mind, before we get moving too far, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about one of our new friends of our show?
Yeah, absolutely. Pretty exciting. But Irish Breakdown just recently partnered with MyBookie. And if you guys are anything like me, I like to throw in some bets and a couple of parlays whenever football's on. I did last night. Don't want to talk about the outcome, but I think it's because I didn't use MyBookie. If I'm being 100% honest with you. So if you go and sign up with MyBookie and use promo code IRISH, IRISH, pretty simple, pretty easy to remember, they will match your deposit up to 100%, which is fantastic. Basically giving you free money to play with and to throw bets around with. One thing that I've been doing specifically for the NFL is I have been taking the over on rushing yards for running backs who play on teams with pretty good offensive lines. Right? You combine that with the MyBookie risk-free Thursdays, makes for a pretty exciting night of Thursday night football, which is something that I may or may not be partaking in. You can also enroll in their loyalty program, and you can earn extra cash just for throwing in some bets and just for placing down some parlays, which I will also be partaking in. So check out MyBookie.
Vince is fired up about this.
Oh yeah.
Man.
Oh, 100%.
No
yeah,
doubt.
him and I have been talking back and forth about some potential things that we've been throwing in the last couple of weeks. So, but definitely check out MyBookie. It's a sports book that gives you control and rewards you for every moment of play.
Trevor, man, I tell you what, you start talking about that. I start thinking about all the games this weekend and so much action over the next 4 weeks with Notre Dame. Well, next 5 weeks with Notre Dame off and kind of what's going to happen this weekend. And I did my first playoff projection yesterday. So I put that at irishbreakdown.com, and you can also find that on the premium board. Man, there's a lot to keep us interested here over the next 5 weeks, man. There's no doubt about that. But right now, Notre Dame is in a position where they control their destiny to a degree. Right? Notre Dame is not one of those teams that controls its own destiny. And if they win, they're in guaranteed because they have an automatic bid, right? They're not like Oregon is in control of their own destiny. I think Texas A&M right now is a team that's certainly in control of their own destiny. And Iowa State, BYU are two teams that are in control of their own destiny. Miami is a team that's in control of its own destiny. Clemson is a team that's in control of its own destiny right now. Well, actually, no, they're not, actually, because there's so many other different tiebreakers. I don't really know where Clemson is. Actually, no, they're undefeated in their league. So actually, they're good. So it's going to be wild. There's going to be potential multiple. The Big Ten and the ACC have a chance to have, I believe, 3 undefeated teams here down the stretch in conference play. Clemson and Pitt play each other, so one of them is going to lose. But SMU also plays Pitt, right? So they could beat Pitt, knock them off. Clemson can stay undefeated. And then obviously Miami doesn't, I don't think, plays any of those teams. So it's going to be fascinating, dude, as we kind of look at how this season is going to close. But for Notre Dame, Trevor, it's all about handling your business. And the odds of Notre Dame not being in the playoff, no matter what ESPN and others want to tell you, if Notre Dame wins out, I'm shocked. I don't see any scenario when you look at who has to play from here on out. And when you look at how the computer models look at some of Notre Dame's upcoming opponents, like there's 2 computer models that I know are respected that have USC as a top 20 team right now at 4-4 because of the schedule they've played and their metrics and things like that. So that's going to be fascinating to look at. But the question is going to then be about, okay, what's the seeding? Where are they going to be, a 5, 6, 7, 8 and get a home game, or are they going to be lower? That's going to be determined a lot by how Notre Dame plays here down the final stretch, Trevor. And this stretch run is going to be very, very fascinating. And if you're a Notre Dame fan, there's a couple things you need to be thinking about over these next 5 weeks, okay, beyond what Trevor was just talking about. And it's going to be looking at, okay, you got to do some scoreboard watching. And not scoreboard watching from the standpoint of, oh, I need to worry about teams ahead of Notre Dame losing. It's more so looking at the teams that Notre Dame plays and hope they keep winning. And then also some of the teams that Notre Dame has already played. You want to see them continue to win. And that's kind of what we're going to discuss here today at the beginning of show 1, which looks at the stretch run for Notre Dame, Trevor. And when you look at Notre Dame and what they've got coming down over this, they're going to get a nice little bye week this week, going to get a little healthier. You're going to get a chance for your new look offensive line to get some time together. And then come out of the bye, Notre Dame plays Florida State at home, 7:30 p.m. on November 9th. Then a week later, it's Senior Day. Notre Dame does last 2 games are away from home. So let November 16th, 3:30 kickoff against University of Virginia. That will be like we said, Senior Day. It's another important game. Week later, week before Thanksgiving, Notre Dame heads out to New York, where you'll be there for that one, covering that game. And they're going to take on Army inside Yankee Stadium. And then they finish the season the week Saturday after Thanksgiving out in LA. I'll be out there for that one. And Notre Dame will be looking to hopefully for them win their 4th straight game, which will all but assure, in my opinion, that Notre Dame is in the playoff, barring them just looking bad in those games down the stretch. So that's where Notre Dame is, Trevor. It's get yourself right during this bye week, get a little healthier, and then this stretch run is going to determine who this team is for Notre Dame as we move forward.
The first bye week proved extremely beneficial for Notre Dame. I think that's something that everybody can agree on. Prior to the first bye, the team was a little shaky. There were some different aspects of the team that we're going to dive into and kind of compare and contrast what happened before and what we're going to be looking forward to moving on. But this final stretch is going to be massive for Notre Dame. I think there's a lot of emphasis from the national media that talks about how it's a very favorable schedule. Maybe, potentially, but there are some teams to look out for. Army's still ranked and undefeated. I predict that that's going to be the same case. There are some things that Notre Dame has to correct from some of the mistakes that were made against Navy when you go and play a team like Army. And again, I'm just somebody that's never going to count out a USC team. Now, in the lens of when Notre Dame plays them, right?
Yeah.
It's a rivalry game.
Yes.
It's a rivalry game. It is at LA. It's in the Coliseum. And USC has every single one of their losses has been by 1 possession. So this isn't a team that's going in week over week and just getting blown out. Right. And it's not one that I would want to sleep on. So there's a lot of things that Notre Dame has the ability to continue to build off of it. And it's a nice shift because before the first bye week, we talked a lot about this is what needs corrected. And this is what the team needs to fix in order to kind of take that next step. And for the most part, they did that, which is really comforting. Now it's about fine-tuning some of those things. Now it's taking that next step, because I've talked a lot this season about benchmarking spots for Notre Dame. That first bye week was one of them. And through this next 3 games, I kind of passed a lot of the questions that I had. Now this next bye week and this Final Four stretch of games is the next benchmarking tool that we're going to use before Notre Dame gets into the playoffs in the postseason. So I'm excited to dive into it all week with you, Bryan. We're going to talk about a lot of good things here. So I'm ready, man. Let's get after it.
To kick things off, let's kick things off. To kick things off, let's look at just briefly the 4 opponents that Notre Dame is going to play down the stretch, because I love what you had to say about USC, and we're going to talk a lot about that. Obviously, Notre Dame starts against Florida State here in 2 weeks. The Seminoles have a home game against North Carolina. I'm very fascinated to see how that game goes. I really am. You talked about Florida State sitting here right now; they're 1-7, and when you watch them play, Trevor, the Georgia Tech game they had a shot in. They didn't really have a shot against Memphis, in my opinion. They got blown out by Boston College. They got blown out by SMU. They got blown out by Clemson. They got blown out by Miami. They were in the Duke game, but they trailed, I think, almost the entire game. And, some Jamaican Brian Driscoll. Yeah, that's like, what is this? I'm not a politician. I don't fake accents. You look at it and you're saying, okay, so what happens this weekend at home against North Carolina, I think could have an impact on what kind of team Notre Dame faces when they come to South Bend in 2 weeks. And what I mean by that is, look, this team has not a lot to play for, big picture. And the reasons that this team has struggled so much are reasons why I think they're not going to be super fired up coming into the Notre Dame game. I don't see how they all of a sudden go 1-8 and now let's care now. Let's care about this game. There's always that fear that I have of looking at a team that is motivated, I guess is a way of putting it, right? To prove something, where individual players are there to prove something about the NFL and all these other type of things. But when you look at it, it's still one of those things, Trevor, where I say, I'm not sold that they're going to be, as a team, overly motivated if they lose to North Carolina, because it's like, all right, whatever. Like they're not in bowl contention, but is the Notre Dame game where some of these guys come and play really well the next 2 weeks and then opt out after that because they played really well against Notre Dame and they've got that spotlight game against a highly ranked team? And they battled against Miami. They just were completely outclassed, but they've competed in that Miami game. They haven't quit yet. And that's why I think this North Carolina game is important, because if they're at home, Carolina's playing better football of late, almost beat Georgia Tech a couple weeks ago, battled Pitt, lost by Duke to a point, and then this past weekend went on the road and destroyed Virginia. So if North Carolina goes down to Tallahassee and the Seminoles win, is that enough of a spark that says, hey, look, guys, let's finish this thing strong. Guys that are around, let's finish this thing strong. If they lose, it tells me that's a team that's pretty much just ready to pack it in. But that's why it concerns me, Trevor, because there's no value for Notre Dame in beating Florida State by 40, 50, in regard to teams aren't going to look at them like, wow, you blew out Florida State. You're a phenomenal team. That's not there. A close loss, a close win could be like, dude, how did you guys struggle against a 1-7 team? No one's going to be like, it is Florida State. They still have a lot of, NFL time. No, it's going to be bad. But here's the other reason this game matters for me, Trevor. You just watched a team that's ranked ahead of you, a team that, if they lose a game, is going to be in contention with you for seeding, right? So if Miami runs a table, it's irrelevant how the two teams compared. But you've got a team that is that if they drop a game, whether it be the ACC championship and whether it's a game where they just get upset by somebody, whatever the case may be, Trev, Miami is a team that if Notre Dame comes down to them, they're going to have a couple common opponents. And this is another one. The first common opponent that the two teams had is Louisville, and they both won by a touchdown. Notre Dame won by a touchdown at home. Miami won by a touchdown on the road. If you look at game control, Notre Dame was the more impressive team. They led Louisville much longer and by more convincing margins than what Miami did for much of that game. However, if you look at statistics, Miami had better statistics than Louisville did, whereas Louisville had more yards than Notre Dame had. And I don't know if all the committee members are going to necessarily dive into the fact that that's because Notre Dame had short fields and a big lead and all that other kind of stuff. So, but it's going to be kind of a wash. I would say it's kind of a wash. There's some areas where Notre Dame did better, some areas where Miami did better. Notre Dame was at home, Miami was on the road. This is going to be your second chance, Trevor, to have an opponent. And there's two left on the schedule because Miami also has to play at Georgia Tech in a couple weeks, to where you could say, okay, you beat Florida State 36-14 and you ran up the score. Did you watch the fourth quarter of that game? Miami ran up the score. They ran a trick play in the fourth quarter up like 23-7 with like 4.5 minutes to go, which was, I thought, was nonsense. And then they put another score on them at the end of the game, 36-14. I'm okay with them scoring as much as possible, but I've always said you start running trick plays, now you're trying to run the score up on a team. It's kind of how I feel. So 22-point win for Miami at home, and then 2 weeks later, they have to play Notre Dame at Notre Dame. This is another example where Notre Dame can say, look, Oregon played at Purdue and won by 35. If that comes down to it, we played at Purdue and won by 59. The week after the game where everyone says we were this horrible team and lost to Northern Illinois, a week later, we went and beat that team by 59, right? And so this is another example where you not only have to win on beat Florida State, you have to be locked in and dominate Florida State, because that's where seeding is. I mean, that could be the difference. You played three common opponents. Miami's got a 11-1 record. Let's say they don't get to the ACC title game, or they're 12-1, get to the ACC title game and lose to Clemson. They're going to have these two teams, and they're going to say, okay, Notre Dame played overall a tougher schedule. Miami had the better loss, right? They made the conference championship game. Notre Dame dominated the ACC. Miami dominated the ACC in the regular season. So, okay, we saw three games where you guys played the same team. Who looked better? That could be the difference between Notre Dame being a 6 seed, a 7 seed, or an 8 seed when you talk about stacking them up against Miami. So there's a lot more at stake in this Florida State game, Trevor, than a lot of people think, because they just look at it, well, Florida State sucks, right? And it's there. It's, yeah, you can't overlook anybody. That's fine. That's a given. You can't overlook anybody. But there's a reason why Notre Dame needs to be locked into this game and go out and say, hey, we need to not only win, we need to absolutely destroy this team to not only keep building on our own success, but we're trying the next 4 weeks, Trevor, are opportunities for Notre Dame to make statements to the playoff committee, and it'll be the first Saturday after they make their first rankings. And that's quite a statement to make coming out of the break, is to just annihilate this team that we just saw at least be somewhat competitive against Miami.
Notre Dame has been at the spotlight and kind of the forefront of a lot of national conversation. And it's because of what we've talked about over the last couple of weeks. The college football playoff is going to come down to who towards the end of the season starts to get hot, right? Who is going to start turning it on a little bit, and who's going to start really separating themselves. And one reason why I believe that Notre Dame made such a drastic jump in this past AP poll is because of this 3-game stretch that they had went on. Because for those who don't know, Notre Dame outscored their opponents 131-34 through 3 games. It's impressive. It's very impressive, including capping that off against an undefeated Navy team that was averaging 44.8 points per game. When you start listing off the teams in front of Notre Dame, the room for error is slowly starting to get smaller for them, because Notre Dame is now kind of nipping at the heels. You know, about a month ago, Notre Dame was honestly kind of an afterthought. And we here at Irish Breakdown, we're just talking about, take it 1 week at a time, take care of business, go 1-0 every week. Now Notre Dame is back in that contention. They're back in the top 10 for conversations about, one slip up from one of these top 7 teams. Right. Notre Dame is in contention with leapfrogging. About the Florida State game specifically, I think the thing that makes me the most nervous for it is one of the most dangerous opponents to play are teams that have nothing to lose. Nothing to lose at all. And that's, if Notre Dame destroys Florida State, one, people will be like, duh, right? Like nobody's going to look at that and say, well, I mean, Notre Dame hasn't done that this season, which if you go and look at the inferior opponents that they've played, they've won by a really big
Yeah, they've
margin.
dominated several opponents. They have not
Right.
really played many competitive games this year, Trevor. Outside the game they lost, I mean, since
Right.
A&M and Northern Illinois, the only competitive
Yeah.
game was Louisville, and that was a game that
Mhm.
Notre Dame led for over 52 minutes
Yeah,
of the game.
absolutely. 100%. And I think the thing that makes it even more dangerous is when you compound the fact that not only does Notre Dame win and have to win, they have to win now. The expectation is by a certain margin. Maybe not by us, maybe not by IB Nation or Notre Dame fans, maybe some Notre Dame fans, but national media is going to start paying attention to, okay, well, Notre Dame just beat a 1 and potentially 8 Florida State team by 10. What's that about? At home, at night.
Right.
So it's kind of the recipe for, I'm not talking about a recipe for an upset. I do believe that those days are behind Notre Dame, despite what we saw earlier in the season. But now when you have on one side a team where they have to start winning very convincingly the remaining 4 games, and another team who has literally 0 things to lose. They're no longer bowl eligible. They have nothing to lose. And they have a lot of really good skilled position players on their team. They do. They're just not a good team. And that's evident watching them through their first 8 games. So it's going to be interesting to watch the Florida State game. I don't want to heighten this up and say Notre Dame's on upset alert. I don't want to create that narrative, but it is a game that could be.
Because they're just not good.
Right.
They're just not good, Trevor. I mean, it's not, they're no longer a team like, boy, if they figured out, they got some, no, they're not that team anymore.
100%.
You look at Notre Dame and their 6-game winning streak, Trevor. They have outscored their opponents by an average of 31.3 points per game since the Northern Illinois game. And the average score of those games is 42.7 to 11.3. That's what Notre Dame has done in the 6 games since Northern Illinois. The reason I'm saying that is that's a reason why you're seeing Notre Dame start getting more respect from national folks. Is they're not just winning, they're dominating. They've won by 59, 25, 7, 42, 18. The other team scored last late in the game, and 37. And 2 of those teams that you played during that stretch were ranked and are receiving votes in the most recent AP Top 25. So you can lose all that momentum by losing, obviously, but also by, if you remember 2015, Notre Dame was getting a ton of love from the committee in 2015. They had that great loss to Clemson, and then they were kind of coming out of looking at their I'm trying to think of how many games. I'm actually going to look it up right now. I'm trying to think of how many games they had. But they after the Clemson game, they went out and blew out Navy, who was ranked. They beat USC by 10. They went on the road and beat Temple in a national TV game, if you remember that one. They went on the road and blew up Pittsburgh. And Notre Dame climbed all the way up to number 3 in the college football playoff rankings. Was the number 4 in the rankings that year. And then they went and played. They had Wake at home, who was not very good. And they played Boston College at home, who was not very good, or in Fenway, who was not very good. And they struggled in both of those games. And even though they won, they fell 2 spots out of the rankings. And Oklahoma was at 1 spot. They fell from 4 to at least 5, and I think maybe 6, because it was a 5. Trevor, they fell to 5, right?
They went from 5, and then after the Boston College game, they went down to 6. So in back-to-back weeks, they dropped.
Right. Mm-hmm. And why? They were still winning, but they were looking bad. And then Oklahoma was blowing people out, and that's the first team that jumped them after the Wake game. And so that stuff matters. For people to say, well, style points don't matter. Yeah, they do. We've seen it before. Why did Notre Dame in 17 jump all the way up to number 3, even though they had a home loss to Georgia? Well, the loss was good, but they were annihilating people. They were blowing people out. And so that stuff matters. How you win matters. We could discuss whether it should or shouldn't, but if you're a great team that should be playing for a championship, you should have a lot of those games that are not close games. And so beating Florida State impressively is needed. And doing so, now the players shouldn't be thinking about that. Marcus Freeman should not be saying that, hey guys, we got to win by 50. It's prepare, do what you do, trust the process, play the best to our ability. You know, the comment he made about, you know, we're trying to be the best team we can be. Be the best team you are that Saturday, you'll win by 40 plus potentially. You know, but you can't overlook them. You need to find ways to make sure this team is motivated. But we can talk about what it needs to look like, and it needs to be an impressive win. The same thing is true the next week against Virginia, Trevor, because this is another team that when you look at Notre Dame's schedule and you look at who they play and you look at some of the common opponents and different things like that, you know, this is another team that in Virginia that is, you know, struggling a little bit. They're 4-4. They are off this week as well. And then they play at Pittsburgh. So number one, go Cavs when it comes to beating Pittsburgh, because Pittsburgh is an undefeated team who could if they just keep winning, because Pittsburgh has played a soft schedule so far, but their stretch run could vault them up the rankings if they continue to win, Trev, because when you look at who Pitt plays here in the final stretch, they play at SMU this weekend, then they play Virginia, then they have Clemson at home, then they play at Louisville and at BC. All of a sudden, this team that people don't have a lot of respect for, because so far they've beat Kent State, Cincinnati, West Virginia, Youngstown State, North Carolina, Cal, and Syracuse, right? I think the Syracuse blowout win opened some people's eyes to, hey, Pitt might actually be legit. And if they go out and win some of those games, and all of a sudden, so you're rooting for them to get beat, and then you're also rooting for them to get beat by some of the teams that Notre Dame plays. Virginia being one, and then, of course, Louisville being the other. So hopefully the Cavs can upset that, you know, pull an upset in that game. I don't, let's just say I'm not holding my breath for it. If I'm being completely honest with you, Trevor, I'm not holding my breath that Virginia's going to win that game. But though, you know, let's say they come in 4-5. That's another team that you've got to control. They also have a team in with a like opponent in Clemson. So if Clemson runs the table, goes 11-1. And then loses the ACC championship game to Miami in a competitive game, I don't know about you, Trevor, but I think an 11-2 Clemson team is probably still in. And now we're kind of battling for positioning, right? And so now you've got Clemson instead of Miami, who you're going to be competing with. Well, this is the only common opponent that you have. Virginia went to Clemson, and it was 48-31. It was somewhat competitive early. Then Clemson kind of pulled away and really dominated a lot. And then Virginia had a couple scores late to make it a little bit closer than it looked on paper. It was a 17-point win. I think Virginia scored 21 points in the fourth quarter. Let me go look at that. Yeah, 21 points in the fourth quarter. Clemson scored 10 points in the fourth quarter. It was 38-10 going into halftime. It was fourth quarter. It was 17-10 going into halftime, though. And it was tied 10-10 until Clemson scored with 3.5 minutes left in the second quarter. And then Clemson really piled it on in the third quarter. Virginia eked it back and made it a little bit more closer. First half close, third quarter, Clemson blows out, fourth quarter, Virginia wins. But you look at that game, Trevor, and Virginia tied with Clemson in scoring in one quarter, only got outscored by a touchdown in another quarter, and outscored Clemson by 11 in another quarter. It's that third quarter that broke that game open. So this is a game where you need Notre Dame to come out and from start to finish dominate the opponent, and it's a team that they should. And then the next week, that's the final two games are the ones that are going to be the biggest statement opportunities for Notre Dame in the final. And it starts with Army. And Trevor, that's going to be one where Notre Dame fans – you should always root for, in my opinion, and respect the service academies. That's you guys. You all know my stance on that because of who those young men are and what they stand for. However, you should become an especially big fan of them here over the next few weeks because you need Navy to keep winning and claw back into the top 25, and you need Army to still be undefeated when they play. They're 7-0. They play Air Force this weekend. They play at North Texas, who's 5-3 and a quality team. And then they get a bye week before Notre Dame. This is the first of a 2-game stretch, Trevor, that ultimately is going to define Notre Dame's season.
When you look at their 4-game stretch in from a 10,000-foot view, right? It's real interesting. We just talked about what it looks like for Florida State. For Virginia, it's senior day. There's always distractions on senior day, whether people want to talk about it and admit it or not. There are. It's a meaningful day. Virginia has shown that in the two biggest opponents that they played in Clemson and Louisville, they come to play for those games, right? Again, you want to talk about a team with Not a whole lot to lose if they do lose to Notre Dame, but everything to gain from upsetting Notre Dame at Notre Dame Stadium on their senior day, knocking them out of playoff contention. And then you start looking at the last two games, right? And you look at, they play most likely an undefeated Army team in the Shamrock Series in New York at Yankee Stadium. And then you turn around the following week and play probably the most polar opposite of a triple option offense as possible with Lincoln Riley and Miller Moss at USC in the Coliseum. So, yes, on paper, with Army being the only ranked team, there's a lot of people that are writing this off, but it's going to be a lot of back and forth and different types of preparation for Notre Dame on offense and defense over this next 4-game stretch. But a statement has to be made against Army. It's your last major opportunities to kind of go and make a splash and say, well, all right, Notre Dame is taking that next step. And for anybody that's like, it's a service school, Notre Dame just beat a service school and jumped 4 spots in the AP poll.
Right.
It matters.
And they're going to be, if they win their next 2, Trev, they're going to be ranked higher than what Navy was. And I'm listening to people talking about how Bryson Daly is a Heisman candidate.
Mm-hmm.
The Army quarterback, and whatever you think about that. I mean, the fact is the kid's played 7 games and he's almost got 1,000 yards rushing, and he's got 19 touchdowns as a runner, and he's passed for 629 yards and 7 more touchdowns. So this is a kid that in 7 games has 26 touchdowns and has been very, very dynamic and is getting a lot of hype. And so if they keep winning, they're going to keep getting more and more hype. And people may think that, well, they're not going to really care about service academies. Well, yeah, they will. And we just saw an example of that with the AP, who has always been more negative towards Notre Dame than the playoff committee has been towards Notre Dame. So it's definitely a statement opportunity. It's going to be a primetime game in Yankee Stadium, and you're going to have all the talking heads talking about this is a potential trap game for Notre Dame. And well, although I could see them not doing that this time like they did with Navy, because I think they don't want to set up Notre Dame for another. Like, I could see ESPN talking about why this team's not as good and blah, 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 and not giving us all they could lose. This is, upset alert. So like if you're someone who has Navy as a 7.5 point, on your 10-point scale as a potential upset, and then the next week you try to poo-poo that game and be like, it's Navy, you're going to lose some credibility. And we've seen that. I could see them not doing that the next time because I don't think they want to set Notre Dame up for an opportunity to make another statement, but I don't think it is going to matter. If the committee has Army in the top 25, and that's probably the most fascinating ranking I'm looking to see, or intriguing ranking I'm looking to see, is does the committee put Army in with no good wins just because they're undefeated? Right? They're going to be 8-0 if they win this weekend against Air Force, which is not a given, by the way. But if they are undefeated going into that game, or going into the first rankings, which comes out next Tuesday, a week from today. So we're going to have a show about it that night. We'll have a show. We'll go live after the rankings come out. I'm very curious to see where Army's at, and if they are able to jump into the back of that top 25, which means they need to smack Air Force this weekend. That would be huge for Notre Dame. And then if they're in. And after beating Air Force, they'll definitely be in after beating North Texas because they have a winning record. They're 5-3, and that goes on the road. And I do think that if the committee likes Notre Dame, here's why I think it's going to matter, Trevor. If the committee likes Notre Dame, then they're going to like Army. You catch my drift? Right? We've seen this before. If they like Army, if they like Notre Dame, then they're going to like Army. And then that sets up that ranked matchup between the two of them. So that also factors into, okay, the intrigue that I have about will Army be ranked in that first bout of top 25? And then if they beat Air Force, and they're not ranked, do they then jump in if they beat North Texas on the road? And they're now 9-0 and in one of the top group of 5 leagues. It's going to be really interesting. So it could potentially be a huge opportunity for Notre Dame to make a big statement, assuming that they can handle their business and handle it in impressive fashion.
Army's potential to be ranked high also kind of goes hand in hand with, you brought it up earlier, their starting quarterback is in talks of being in the Heisman race, and he has it. It kind of fuels that fire for one, like what people want to see, right? Like it's Notre Dame, Army, Yankee Stadium at night, primetime game. Not a lot of football games are played at Yankee Stadium, right? So I could see Army being ranked up there, and if not before the North Texas game, then definitely after, for sure.
I'm not saying that mockingly, just so people are clear
No.
that Bryson Daly's in the Heisman conversation. Yes, he has not played good competition, but he's putting up absurd numbers. And he's a quarterback that has 909 rushing yards. He's gone for at least 110 in each of the last 6 games, and he scored at least 2 touchdowns in his last 5 games. And he scored in 6 of the 7 games this year they've played, he scored at least 2 rushing touchdowns, and he's had at least 3 rushing touchdowns in 4 of the 7 games they've played in. So he's an impressive, a really impressive young man, and he's accounted for at least 1 touchdown in every game they've played. Because in the one game he didn't have a rushing touchdown, he had a passing touchdown in that game. So, and he's coming off of a game against East Carolina where he ran for 171 yards, passed for a season high 147 yards, and accounted for 6 touchdowns. So he's peaking. He's coming off of his best game. So we'll kind of see how that one plays out. So I'm very fascinated to see that one, Trevor. And then of course in the final week of the season, I love that you. We like to have fun, Southern Cal and mocking USC, and they're a rival, but we're going to be serious with this analysis about USC. This is a far more dangerous team than I think a lot of folks want to give them credit for because they look at the record. And then they also look and see who they've played. And when you look at who USC has gotten beat by, it is kind of easy to dismiss them. You know, they lost at Michigan, who's not very good. They lost at Minnesota, who's not very good. They lost at Maryland, who's not very good. They are not very good away from home when they play in true road games. They're just not. And that's why I'm very fascinated to see how they play this weekend against Washington. But here's the reality. At home, they blew out Utah State. They were down 21-10 to Wisconsin, ended up winning 38-21. They blew out Rutgers at home this past weekend, 42-20. Wasn't really that close. And they took Penn State to overtime at home in their other home game. And this is a team that also beat LSU on a neutral field. Their 4 losses are by combined 14 points. 14 points. And they're going to have a lot to play for in that Notre Dame game, especially if they keep winning. And here's the other thing. If you're a Notre Dame fan, you know, fight on the next 4 weeks because you want them to win out. If you look at the way the computers view USC, if they're coming into that Notre Dame game, winners of it would be 4 straight games against Rutgers, at Washington, home against Nebraska, at UCLA. It's not out of the realm of possibility, Trevor, that they crack the top 25. Well, I'm not saying they should or shouldn't, but the computer models love USC. If USC starts winning some of these games and then they look at, they've had nothing but close losses, they blow these. They'd have to blow these next 3 opponents out. I don't think they can just squeak by with 7-point wins and then jump in the top 25 unless there's just a bunch of chaos and there's a bunch of 3-4 loss teams. But if they dominate the way they did against Rutgers this past weekend, it's not out of the realm of possibility that USC is ranked. But even if they're not, it's still a 7-4 opponent and a rivalry game and what will most likely be a primetime game that night, Saturday after Thanksgiving. So it's your last chance if you're Notre Dame to make a statement. And let's not remind people what happened the last time a Notre Dame team that was playing for a playoff spot went out to LA against a bad USC team that's much worse than this one. It was a 4-quarter dogfight. I'm talking about 2018. It wasn't until Tony Jones caught that swing pass in the 4th quarter that game kind of got put out of hand. And I think Notre Dame was down 10-0 at one point in time in that game. So USC is going to be sitting there with no championship to play for. They're not going to the playoff, but you know what they can do? We can ruin Notre Dame season. That's exactly what they're going to be playing for and talking about all week. For the NFL guys, this is your chance to put on some big-time film for the NFL scouts. For the rest of us that, maybe are coming back next year, this is our opportunity to go out there and ruin our rival season. And you know what I mean? And they are absolutely going to have a lot to play for. So that's going to be – now that doesn't mean Notre Dame can't win. It doesn't mean Notre Dame can't win handily. It just means Notre Dame's going to have to bring their A game against the Trojans because, number one, they need to win. But number two, if they beat USC, it's going to be, they're 7-5. How good of a team were they really? Which is why you need an impressive win over USC. That's a lot to put on a team. Like, you got to not only win, but you got to win convincingly. But we've seen Notre Dame do that for the last month and a half.
It's a big week. There's no there's no doubt about it. We've talked a lot this season about Notre Dame has the opportunity they have almost like a revenge type game against Louisville for what they did to them at a national stage last year. And they have the opportunity to get right against Stanford because of what Stanford did to Notre Dame at home in 2022. Does anybody remember how that USC Notre Dame game went last year on national television in prime time? That's going to be a topic of discussion for USC that week as much as it was for Notre Dame in the Stanford and Louisville games, right? So Lincoln Riley is still one of the best offensive minds in college football. Now his abilities as a head coach, who knows? But as an offensive-minded person,
we're starting to know.
Fair enough.
Because he didn't step in for Bob Stoops this time.
True.
He didn't inherit a Bob Stoops built team this time, and he's had to build it on himself, and he hasn't been able to.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
To your point, though, offensive mind-wise, he's still, like you said, he's one of the best. There's no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. And the storyline for that week for me will be, again, Al Golden versus Lincoln Riley and that great chess match. There's been so many great chess matches matched up against Al Golden this year, and right now he's won most of them, right? So it's going to be interesting. It's a rivalry game, and nothing fuels a rivalry more than one team has the opportunity to spoil the season for the other. For me, it's almost right up there with whoever wins is going to get into the playoffs, or whoever wins is getting into the conference championship. So, maybe I just have a little PTSD from the last time Notre Dame played out in LA against USC in 2022. Or maybe I have a little PTSD about a 10-1 team from 2015 going out to California in the final week of the season and losing and essentially knocking themselves out of playoff contention. So it's going to be, it was Stanford, but still, it's just
out in California, right?
Mm-hmm. So,
right. There's to your point, Trevor, 2012, not a very good USC team, Notre Dame team playing for championship, and that game went down to the wire. 2018, sub 500 USC team, undefeated Notre Dame team. That game went down to the wire because it's when you talk about these rivalry games, you throw it out of the window. And here you brought up something too, Trevor, that I think I want to hit on before you move on. There's a lot of rumblings that Lincoln Riley would like to get out of USC and maybe go to the NFL. What's one way to impress NFL teams? Go against Al Golden and his NFL-style defense and have success. Right? Hey, I've coached against Al Golden 3 years now, and I ripped him up in 2 of those 3 years. You know what I mean? Like, don't think that those things aren't going to be selling points. And somebody, IGK, Irish Gordy Knott, said something in the chat. He's like, Lincoln Riley has always done his best to ignore the relevance of the Notre Dame rivalry. He won't this year because he needs it for motivation this year. He absolutely needs it this year. He'll sell the heck out of it to his football team. And so it's going to make for a very interesting game. And it's going to, like you said, so Notre Dame's going to have to do something that nobody else did. And let's talk about, again, what could this mean for the college football playoff rankings? Well, USC 7-5. Okay, I get that. But you and Penn State, who let's say they're 11-1 with a loss to Ohio State. You both have a common opponent in the same stadium. You needed overtime to beat them. If Notre Dame goes out there and rips USC up, now all of a sudden, okay, you're both 11-1. Neither of you played for a conference championship. Notre Dame has the best win of the group, which would be their win over A&M. Their next 2-3 wins are comparable. All right, we've got one common opponent, USC, same stadium, right? What happened? So it's not just, okay, beating this team means something. It's these common opponent things are absolutely part of the criteria that the committee will use when separating teams from a seeding standpoint. It absolutely will be. So when you're talking about going against potentially Clemson or Miami, if one of them loses the ACC title game, you're going to have common opponents to stack up against them. When you talk about Oregon, if they're a one-loss team by the time we get to the playoff committee, you will have a common opponent against them. We talk about Penn State, you will have a common opponent against them. Not just common opponent, but common opponent in the same, you both played them in the same building. They'll have multiple common opponents with Miami. And so the committee will and always has looked at those things. So you guys are wondering why we're talking about this. That's why. It's not just looking at those 4 games, but it's how you play in these 4 games. Winning is obviously important, but it's not the only thing that they take out of it where they just said, okay, well, Notre Dame's 11-1 now, and that's all we care about. No, it's okay, you're 11-1, but what's your resume? And how does it stack up against this 11-1 Penn State team who lost by a touchdown to Ohio State at home. Okay, well, Penn State's got the better loss, right? Clearly the better loss. Even if they lose by 14, people will look at a 14-point loss and still respect that more than a 2-point loss in Northern Illinois at home. It's just facts. So unless they lose by 40 to Ohio State, Penn State's going to have a better loss than Notre Dame, right? They'll lose to a better team no matter what, but a 40-point loss, I think, is worse than losing at home by 2 to a team that everybody knows you should have beat.
Yeah.
So then it comes down to what's the common opponent. You get to the other criteria, average margin of victory. Notre Dame is far more dominant in their wins than Penn State has been in their wins. Far more dominant. Okay, well, that's Big Ten versus ACC, so that's going to take down that a little bit. All right, well, you guys did play one common opponent. No, Notre Dame did play, 2 Big Ten teams, and how are they going to view that? Because Penn State plays at Purdue on November 16th. So you're going to be able to look at an 11-1 Penn State and an 11-1 Notre Dame and say, okay, 2 common opponents. You played each other. You played them on the same exact stadium, in the same exact stadium. How did those 2 games go? Well, Notre Dame's already set the bar for one at 59. Penn State set the bar for the other 3 in overtime. You know what I mean, Trevor? So that's why we talk about it's not just winning that matters. If Notre Dame wins their next 4 games by a field goal, yeah, it's great. They're 11-1. They are not going to get respected by the committee. Because they're going to be like, you're not playing very good football. You're going into this stretch run playing mediocre football. You're just beating teams you have more talent than. That's not going to be viewed favorably. They have to win, and they have to look good winning because you do have these common opponents that they will absolutely look at and compare to. We may not think it's relevant, Trevor, and people in the chat may say, why are we talking about this? We have seen it for the last 10 years. Common opponents is absolutely one of the top things they look at beyond head-to-head and overall record when you start talking about where teams are going to be seated in the college football playoff. And where you get seated matters because being 7 versus 6 matters a whole lot, right? Being 6 versus 5 matters a whole lot. It could be the difference between playing an undefeated Miami team and a 2-loss Kansas State team or a 1 or 2-loss Iowa State team or BYU in the Big 12 title game, right? Or actually it could be a 2-loss Kansas State team. But you know what I mean? Like being 6 versus 7 could be the difference between you playing Miami or you playing Georgia or Texas or you know what I mean? Like that's my point is that's why the seeding matters. And these head-to-head, these common opponent matchups are going to have a big impact on how Notre Dame is viewed.
One small little nugget here too with the Penn State comparison and comparing the schedules and the common opponents. The College Football Playoff Committee does a really good job of not including recency bias as much in comparison to the AP poll and the coaches poll, I would argue. But I will say there is going to be some factor as well when you look and compare teams like Notre Dame and Penn State. You have one where one loss might be better if Penn State does end up losing to Ohio State. But the committee could also look at that too and say Notre Dame hasn't lost a football game since September 7th.
Yeah.
Barring them handling business the next 4 games, because that is also a factor.
Right. Assuming that, right.
And then you could go back and say Penn State lost at home on November 2nd. So I don't think that that's going to ultimately sway their decision.
That beat Nebraska the week before.
Right.
That's going to be the conversation.
So there will be a recency factor, but it won't by any means be the deciding decision. But that is going to be something that is weighed heavily more on Notre Dame's side of saying they haven't lost a football game since week 2. And every game that they've played since then has been a pretty dominant win. It's a 1-point or a 1-possession victory over Louisville. Notre Dame led that game outside of every possession outside of Louisville's first possession where they got the ball on like the 18-yard line after a fumbled kickoff. So
yeah, they trailed for 1 possession and didn't lead for 2.
Yep.
Right. So, but after their second possession, they had a lead that they never relinquished in that game. It was never tied again. And they were a double-digit lead for, I believe, over half the game.
Yep.
That's going to matter. And then, again, you look at Penn State plays at Purdue. Okay, well, Notre Dame played Purdue after they lost to Northern Illinois and went out and won by 59. What are you guys going to do? Right, you're 2 weeks removed from losing to Ohio State. What are you going to do? Oh, you won by 24? Okay, cool. It's a good win. But, all right, well, You guys beat USC on the road by 3 in an overtime in a game where you were down, I think, was it 20-3 at one point in time? All right, well, Notre Dame just beat them by 17 and never trailed. And you know what I mean? Like, those things could be the difference. Okay, we like Penn State. They're a playoff team. We like Notre Dame. They're a playoff team. But now we're going to put Notre Dame as the 6 and Penn State as the 7. Or Penn State is the 6 and Notre Dame is the 7. Or 7 and 8. And then, of course, the spot you get higher, then that's the lower seeded team that you're going to get to play in the first round. So this stuff matters. It's not just get in. Getting in is obviously the big picture goal, but you want to get in and be seeded as best as possible. Not as high as possible, but as best as possible. Sometimes the higher seed could be better. Sometimes it may not be better. You know what I mean? But I think the higher seed you are, the better it is, because you're going to get the, for a host of reasons, you're going to get the lowest seeded teams that made it, and then you're going to get the lowest seeded conference champions if you get up there. So getting up into the 5-6 range is absolutely the goal for Notre Dame, and how they win their next 4 games, assuming they win, how they win the next 4 games could have a big impact on that. On top of, obviously, you need some other teams to drop games, but like if Penn State beats Ohio State and runs the table, then Notre Dame still has that talking point against Penn State, because you say, yeah, Penn State's the undefeated Big Ten champs. And guess what? We looked way better than they did against the 2 common opponents we played. And then Ohio State falls behind you, because there's no way a 2-loss Ohio State team against the schedule they played, where they lost to the only 2 good teams they played all year, there's no way they're going to be seated ahead of Notre Dame. They may still make the playoff. Shouldn't, but they may still make the playoff. But there's no way they're seated higher than Notre Dame if they drop a second game. So this game matters a lot. So Notre Dame could be in a situation where they say, hey, listen, we beat the SEC champ, or at least the team playing for the SEC championship, at their place by 10. The Big Ten champ, we have 2 common opponents. They beat those 2 teams by combined, let's say, 35 points. We beat those teams by combined 90 points, right? I mean, those things matter. Oh, in the ACC champ, we had 3 common opponents, and we looked way better against those 3 common opponents than they did. That's what's at stake for Notre Dame in this finish. And so that's why people may not – it may seem like I think of that Charlie Day meme, which I talked about last week, where he's like got this conspiracy thing, and it's like it's so true, but that's what it is. That's how the committee doesn't look at your record, your points per game, and your points allowed per game. They dig into the weeds to get into the stuff, and looking at common opponents amongst teams that are playoff caliber teams is absolutely going to be in the top part of that conversation for Notre Dame, and it also vaults Notre Dame up the computer rankings, way up the computer rankings. And that is going to be something that they look at as well, Trevor. So that's why we took this dive into their opponents. And it's not just about the 4 opponents right now. It's about Notre Dame having an opportunity, if they win out, to not only be one of the hottest teams in college football, outside of maybe A&M. If they beat Texas, then A&M's hot streak started a week before Notre Dame's did, right? Because Notre Dame beat them in week 1. But you could say, hey, they're as hot as we are, but we beat them. And so that's the opportunity that's in front of Notre Dame in this final 4-game stretch, Trev.
It's going to be interesting, man. It's going to be interesting. I mean, the Texas A&M conversation is one that's been especially highlighted after LSU went in and lost in the fashion that they did. But it's 2 of the hottest teams in college football, man. I mean, the end of this season, and I've talked to some buddies about this. You and I have sat back and talked about this. The month of November in college football is going to be bananas. And I'm here enjoying the ride and ready to see what happens. And as long as our boys take care of business, it's going to be a good month. It's going to be a good month.
You talk about A&M being hot, and they are. And this past weekend's game was eye-opening for them. But here's the margin of victory for Texas A&M since the Notre Dame game, where they lost by 10. They won by 42 against an FCS team. They won by 13, 6, 4, 31, 10, and 15. Notre Dame, since winning by 10 over A&M and losing Northern Illinois, has won by 59, 25, 7, 42, 18, and 37. So that's why Notre Dame's starting to get more love, because people see that and they're like, guys, they're not just winning. Yes, they're not playing great teams, but they're dominating those teams in a way that we're not seeing from Georgia. We're not seeing from Alabama. Alabama barely beat a South Carolina team that honestly, when you compare how Notre Dame has done against common opponents, Georgia Tech's, the Louisvilles, I don't even think Louisville's a comparison. I think they're beneath Louisville, but the Georgia Techs, the Navies, Notre Dame is dominated in those games. And so that is kind of how you look at it is, Texas just, hanging on to beat Vanderbilt. I mean, there's just all these games where you say all these teams are having these wins, but they're ugly wins while Notre Dame is just out wiping the floor with people. And so that stuff is going to factor into it, Trevor. If you don't have big time opponents to play, then it's about how you look in those games. Right. And we've seen evidence of that in the past. Notre Dame just kept winning in 2015 and they dropped out of the top 4. Why? Because they didn't look good in winning. And we've seen this before. I mean, that's partly why Ohio State jumped in 2014. People look and say, I can't believe Ohio State didn't deserve to be in, and they had that bad loss to Virginia Tech, who finished the year with a 7-6 record. And, TCU had a better loss and blah, 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 blah. But if you go look at Ohio State down the stretch, man, I mean, they weren't just winning. They were winning. They were beating good teams, but they were winning convincingly outside of the Minnesota game. They beat Michigan State on the road, who was ranked 8th at the time, by 12, and it wasn't that close. They beat Indiana by 15. They beat Minnesota on the road, who was ranked in the top 25. They beat Michigan 42-28, but if I remember correctly, it wasn't that close of a game. And then they absolutely annihilated Wisconsin. I don't know if beating Wisconsin 20-17 in the Big Ten title game would have been enough to put Ohio State up into the top 4. I don't, because they weren't in the top 4 going into that game. But after a while, you're like, okay, they're winning every week. They're beating ranked teams by 2 touchdowns. And then they went out against a top 15 team and annihilated them. How you win matters. There's no doubt about it. And that's what's at stake for Notre Dame. So it's going to be very, very interesting. And then, of course, if other teams lose, that's the ultimate goal for Notre Dame, is other teams lose and keep dropping behind them. But you also want to – here's the other thing too, Trev. You want to go into the stretch between the end of the season and the playoff game playing good football. Because you're not going to get a chance to get things. If you're sloppy your last 2 games against Army and Navy, you don't have a chance. You don't have a get-right game before you got to play a playoff team. So you want to go in playing good football. There's no doubt about it. So it's going to be fun. So anyway, that's Trev. That's part 1 of today's show. Folks, before we move on to part 2, do us a favor. There's a lot of people in the show today. Go ahead and hit that like button for us. Do us that favor. We really appreciate that very, very much. It helps us out, helps the algorithm, so this show gets in front of more and more people. Make sure you've subscribed to the channel, so that way and hit the notification bell, so that way when we do go live, you will know that we are going live, or when we do publish episodes, you'll know that we publish those episodes. So definitely want to check that out. And if you've not done so, give us a 5-star review on our on whatever podcast platform you listen to us on. And as always, folks, sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. I'm going to have a breakdown, Trev, of the run game coming out later tonight. So I've got the video set. I got to finish drawing up the play cards and things like that. I've got the data set. Interesting takeaway from that game, Trevor. I believe I said in the post-game show, or I said upon further review, that I didn't think it was, it wasn't a super efficient game. But when I broke down the data, I was actually very wrong in that Notre Dame's efficiency against Navy was 75% in the run game. Because some of those 2-yard gains and 3-yard gains were first downs. They were chain movers. So they were a lot more effective from an efficiency standpoint than I thought they were. Because if you look at the starting offense on just designed runs, they only had 128 rushing yards against Navy on just designed runs, which again was in 3 quarters because they didn't play the 4th quarter. They only played 1 possession to the 3rd. But it was on 20 carries. So 6.4 yards per carry, 3 touchdowns. You say, well, yeah, they had a 64-yard run. Yeah, but you also had a 2 and a 1-yard touchdown run. So those things kind of somewhat balance each other out. But they were efficient on 15 of the 20 runs. And I had this formula for what makes an efficient run, right? And so that surprised me, to be honest with you, how efficient they were in this game. So I'll break all that down, why I think that was, and how calling more duo affected that. How calling more duo opened up the inside zone touchdown run from Jeremiah Love, and how the impact of the RPO game also opened up that Jeremiah Love touchdown run. So I'll break all that down in the video. You'll want to check that out, but that's for premium members only. And you can find that at boards.irishbreakdown.com.